Okay, great. Actually, let me amend the last thing I showed you guys. This is great to visualize the horizontal movement. And actually, if you bring that into Illustrator, you get this kind of horizontal, the exact same kind of horizontal film strip. Now, you can imagine that when you move this along, you could reduce the size of the jump over so that these overlay onto each other, kind of like a Marais-esque image. Or if you want a pure animation where this thing changes in of itself, you'll actually want to bake it all in the same point. So, sorry about that. Well, here's what I'm saying. Let me just show you. And I'll actually go and do it again. Let me delete this geometry. Okay. To hide the original geometry. That's not absolutely necessary. And then, instead of moving the objects over, I'm actually going to keep them where they will be. So, we're going to make a new geometry object and say, okay, that's a frame, I need that. And I also want this guy, which is our one part of the fuzz, and this guy, which is also part of the fuzz. So that's really what we want, and then I'll say, okay, instead of this guy, I'll group it into here. Again, the script is becoming a little bit messy, but most of the vision now. Okay, great. Oh, and just to illustrate what I meant about the movement, remember this is moving it horizontally based on the frame number multiplied by the width of it. If you wanted to have it overlap, say, twice onto each other, you could divide the original dimensions and then multiply, which would mean that your frames would persist overlapping each other, and this would kind of be the net effect you get. Just to illustrate. Right, so you could imagine that without the frame, you kind of get this overlapping hazing effect, or hazy effect. In any case, I'm going to go back to the original and remind ourselves that what we're actually doing is just the original not moved object. And so I'm going to start baking. And again, what this is going to do is it's going to bake the new geometry, but just all on top of each other. This is helpful because if you remember, we're inserting this frame number as layers, so the geometry is being baked into different layers, so we can easily separate them out into Illustrator. But Illustrator apparently doesn't request, or it doesn't follow the grouping that Rhino and Grasshopper put on geometry, which I thought it would. So instead of relying on groups to discern different frames or sequences of geometry from each other, I'm just going to use the layers and thus overlay all this geometry on top of each other. Alright, great. Frame 24. Now we have all this geometry overlaid on top of each other. I'm going to select all of it. That's around 58,000 curves. And export it to Illustrator. Great, now once it's done, I'm going to open it in Illustrator. And here we go. I'm going to delete this using this direct selection tool. And if I delete the corner and I keep on doing so, I can in fact get rid of the frame altogether. I could have not exported the frame in Grasshopper, but I wanted that because it helps me see if the images are aligned. And then I'm going to enlarge this a little bit. Whew. Okay, great. Note that Illustrator can get pretty heavy and pretty slow when you're dealing with, 60,000 lines or something like that. If you're really doing that, you might want to think about exporting in different chunks or using different numbers of lines or some other strategy that doesn't make Illustrator pretty heavy, or you could use a faster computer. Here we go. I'm actually going to turn on outline view by pressing Control Y, or this preview, which I think will be a little faster, because it doesn't have to render things with absolute exactness. And I'm going to enlarge the image. Oh, looks like that happened again. Great. Alright, I'm going to try this one more time. If I can't, I'll export it again. Okay, great. Okay, one last time. Apologies for this. Get the animation. Okay, I'm not even going to try to scale. I'm just going to delete this frame. And then I'm going to grab everything and make the stroke weight say 0.2 points. Okay, which looks kind of way more interesting. And maybe I will, whoops, this is a mistake. Maybe I'll select everything and set the opacity to 60%. Okay, and that's immediately a little bit more fun. More fuzzy, kind of like a tarantula. The one other thing I can do is go into layers, and for some reason sometimes when you operate, Grasshopper likes to export the layers in strange orders. It's mostly right, but sometimes a little bit off, so just make sure to reorder these layers. Okay, great. And you can imagine doing a lot of work here. Changing the line weight, changing the line work, the colors of the lines, underlaying things, changing, the lines to dashed lines, adding arrowheads, or probably not, there's a lot of line work you can do, but essentially because you have all the geometry overlaid on top of each other, the chief advantage of this kind of approach is that you can change the lines and have really a fine grain of control, level of control. But since I just want to export this without it going trash, I'm going to, first of all, save the Illustrator file. And that might take a little bit, again, since we're dealing with a lot of lines here. Okay. And in the meantime, while we're doing this, the next steps are I'm going to bring it into Photoshop. And I'll turn it into a GIF using a tutorial that we did earlier in the semester. But you can use any other animation program to do so. You could use After Effects onwards. The reason why I like Photoshop, or I think Photoshop would make sense, especially for your assignment in this case, is because you're dealing with relatively small numbers of frames if you're going this route. Again, you could use HoopSnake to automate it, and if there's enough interest, I can whip something up that maybe runs through 200 frames or 1,000 frames and bakes them all at once. But in the meantime, we'll use Photoshop. Also, Photoshop gives you a high degree of control because you can start creating layers and flattening them, blurring them, and doing other kind of operations that make line work look more than just kind of this sharp vector-based line, but more of a texture, because that's kind of the entire approach that we're going with. I'm actually going to pause the stream. This sure looks like it's flashing, and in the next segment I'll open up Photoshop, or I'll open up Illustrator and I'll show you how to export to Photoshop.